Hey guys, KUZO here, back with another video, and in this video today, I'm going to be telling you guys the story of my biggest art mistake that I regret most. And in order to do this, we're going to have to rewind back to small KUZO and explain some of the process on how I ended up making this big art mistake. So little KUZO really loved Dragon Ball Z, and a lot of time I would either create my own original character, or I would copy some other character. And funny enough, I actually didn't copy that many poses from the books that I had when I was younger. And by the way, they weren't even my books. They were like my friend's books that he let me have. And yeah, anyways, I would end up drawing stuff from that book or either just original characters for Dragon Ball Z. And I would draw those without any reference or anything. And then I remember one time, so I was copying a little bit here and there, and I remember one time I went and I decided to trace, and my brother, he was an artist, and I was always trying to impress him, right? So I went to my brother, and I was like, look at my drawing I did, and he looked at me, and he was like, yeah, you traced this, right? And I was like, what? No, I didn't trace it. I must have been like 8 or 9, and he was like, yeah, no, you traced it, I can tell. People who've drawn for a little while can tell when you trace something. And I finally was like, yeah, I did. And even when I was 9, I was ashamed of what I did because I was trying to pass it off as my own. I ended up deciding from that point on I would never trace anything again like that. Because, I mean, that whole situation just made me feel so dang guilty. It really instilled that into me, that you never trace something and then pass it off as your own. So this was the very beginning step from when I was little that ended up contributing to my biggest art mistake that I regret. So after years of watching Dragon Ball Z and thinking that was the end all be all of all sorts of cartoons and animes. I know it's not a cartoon per se, but the reason why I say that is because when I was younger, I didn't really know it was an anime. I didn't know what anime or manga was at that point in time. So, you know, the older I got, I ended up finding out. So I eventually got into Naruto once it started airing in the US. And that's the point in which I kind of found out what manga was. I had a good idea before that manga was different than the American stuff, like American comics. But when Naruto came out and I started watching the anime and I first got the manga, that's when I realized, oh, okay, there's actually a difference. There's this manga section and then there's a comic section. And around that time, you know, the internet was picking up all right, and I eventually did some research into it and I found out I really liked manga and anime. But yeah, so I ended up really falling in love with Naruto, like a lot. I became a huge Narutard, as I've talked about before, and I really had high respects for Kishimoto, and I kind of, before I started like respecting Kishimoto, first I started respecting the characters in the series, and then I realized there was an author behind it because, you know, Derby Chris, you know, it is what it is. All right, but I ended up taking a lot of the shonen mentality from the characters that were written, like Naruto, and wanted to try to succeed on my own and my own merits with doing manga and trying to become a mangaka. Back then I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what a mangaka was, so I just was like, I want to draw anime. So I kept reading Naruto as like the sole manga that I kept reading back then, and I ended up studying it a lot, but I didn't copy or trace it as much. Trace it, I didn't do at all. Copy it, I didn't do as much because of this little thing called pride that ended up coming in, because I read Naruto and I was like, I need to do it all on my own. And for some reason, in my head, I built up this thought that if I can't look at something and then try to retain the information and understand it and not even look at it again and just try to learn from what I'm looking at and not actually copy it to learn, I didn't feel like I was worthy of being able to like accomplish it. I felt like copying was a cheat or some sort of easy way out. And some of this was also because I heard somewhere that technically our mind, our brain ends up retaining so much more information than what we know visually, and it actually retains scenes and memories and stuff perfectly that we actually can't access when we're awake. And that's why we can see so many awesome things when we're dreaming, like those dreams that feel so real that's in your mind. Your mind made that up. It knows these things and it's there. And I thought to myself, I was like, I have to tap into this. Seen it once, that means it's in my brain. I should be able to figure this out. So this weird sort of complex of making myself feel inferior if I couldn't do this without studying or copying, that I just wasn't worthy of actually performing this craft, that I felt like I should be able to learn these things without actually having to copy, because I thought copying was a version of cheating. Copying and calling it your own, yes, that's wrong. But copying and studies, those are two very closely related things, and they're pretty much the same thing, but it really just depends on what you're using the copy/study for. And I'll talk a little bit more about studies in a minute once we get to that part of the story. But this whole process of telling myself if I copied it was cheating pushed myself into being very hard on myself, even harder than I normally am. And I'm very, very hard on myself. Only in the past few years have I actually started to ease up on myself, because that's a whole story on its own, but I realized I needed to tell myself I could do it. But that whole process ended up taught me to tell myself, you're worthless, you can't do this. But I was a very determined kid, so I was always the person that was like, I'm going to prove you wrong. So I tried to tell myself I wasn't going to do it to try to prove myself wrong. But like, what's going on here? And that's not to say that I didn't already have people that was telling me I couldn't do it. So I already had that, and then I had myself fighting against me. But that's also the type of kid I was. I was the type of kid that learned to turn anger or despair into inspiration and try to turn it into fuel in order to become better. And that's kind of the person I have always been, and shonen manga really pushed that to the forefront of my personality. Now that we've covered the mental state of young KUZO and what that led up to, we can now skip to the final arc of this biggest mistake that I regretted. And we will skip ahead about 13 years or so. And I was a very late bloomer with art. I didn't start feeling like I started making any progress until I was almost 20. And a lot of it had to do with my mentality that I was in, that we just talked about. So a few years after I was 20, I ended up feeling like I hit this wall, and I just didn't understand why I couldn't get any further. And I went on like this for probably like another year or two. A very frustrating time for me as an artist, and I never read any books to get better. I didn't really watch too many videos. I watched like speed paints and stuff like that, but I never watched like full-on tutorial videos until later on. So I remember the time when I was sitting at my desk, and this is when I realized what was wrong. I was sitting at my desk and I was drawing something, and I was like, why doesn't this look right? And so I was just fed up with myself. So I finally went and looked at something, and I compared it to mine, and I was like, wait a second, I'm literally drawing this wrong. What's going on? So I realized it was hard for me to accept, but I realized that I had memorized how to draw these things wrong because of the process that I didn't want to follow. I didn't want to use any sort of copying or references to get better during my practice sessions. And you're probably asking, like, how do you even practice then? Well, I used to just practice based off what I felt like I saw in my head. I would look at stuff, I would study it, then I would not look at it when I was drawing. I would just try to study it with my eyes and try to remember what it looked like, and I never went back to it when I was drawing. It was a very weird disconnect, because more often than not, I just wouldn't look at anything even when I was drawing. I just continuously thought to myself, I should know how to draw this. I saw it once. And once I realized I had memorized all these things wrong, I went back and looked at everything that I was drawing and compared it to other things. I ended up deciding to go all the way back to the basics and fundamentals and actually learning all the basics, trying to master the basics, because I realized I was missing something very fundamental in drawing, which was literally the base to everything in drawing. And for me, it was perspective. There was two things that I regretted most and they were biggest mistakes. And it was not using studies as references to get further and get better, not as your own art, as actual studies to get better during practice sessions, and learning perspective. And for the story about how I decided to actually learn perspective, that night I got so fed up, I ended up getting a sketchbook, and I told myself I'm not going to stop drawing perspective until I start understanding this stuff. So for 2 weeks straight, 14 days, every single night, I drew at least 3 to 4 pages every night, full, like I filled them up. I have the sketchbook, and I might actually show you guys sometime if you guys are interested. But I filled these pages up with all my sketches of perspective, and I started taking reference from anatomy. I learned perspective, I learned anatomy all at the same time. And at this point, I had the motor skills with my hand, so all I needed to do was learn the rules, and I needed to memorize the anatomy. The first week I started doing it, I was so determined, but honestly, I thought I was getting nowhere. It was so hard. I felt like I wasn't getting any better the whole first week. And then all of a sudden, it was so weird. Like day 8, everything just started clicking. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was missing. And this is what I mean when I say I was a stupid kid. And when I realized this, it actually opened up the world for me. And that sounds very ridiculous, but it opened up the world to me because I realized literally everything in the world has a foundation in order for it to stand, or else it will not be able to stand properly on its own. And I applied this to everything with art and even my own life, because you start with the basics and you get into the more complicated things, or else you might trip along the way when you don't know. Like, you can't start multiplication before you know addition. You just can't. So at the end of those 2 weeks, I ended up seeing more progress in my art than I had in the last 2.5 years. And just 1 year after that day of that first sketchbook that I started with that perspective, my art was hardly recognizable from that day. It was amazing. And yeah, that's when I realized that was my biggest art mistake, was literally my own pride telling myself not to take any reference and that I should be able to remember everything. And if you want to see a little bit more expansion on the whole perspective and studying aspect of it, I do have a video called Learn How to Draw Anything, and I'll put the link of that in the description, which most of you probably already seen it. It was one of my older videos since one of my more popular videos, and this story might explain why I'm so passionate in that video about my process on getting better. But yeah, so I hope you guys like this new kind of video format. It's kind of a story video format with some sketching going on in the background that I thought would be fun. But yeah, if you guys have any other story ideas you guys want me to cover or some sort of subject matter, definitely let me know in the comment section. But in any case, big thanks to my Patreons. You guys are the best pencil shinobis there are, and special thanks to my Chunin and Jonin tier Patreons. If anyone wants to join my Patreon, link for that will be in the description. Tutorials, anatomy sheets, and all sorts of stuff like that there. But yeah, if you guys like this video, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you're new to this channel, like what you see, please subscribe. Hit the bell icon to get notified when each video comes out. And like always, guys, hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.